Hello, welcome back to another video. I appreciate you watching. Today I'll be discussing something a little different than I normally do. Well, something I haven't discussed in a long time, at least video games, specifically the war that has been waged on them. What is this war, you may ask? This war can be described as the effort of politicians and other various organizations to restrict video games in various ways, such as their sales and distribution. This has largely been based on the grounds that video games cause violence. This, however, simply is not true for a variety of reasons which I'll be discussing. So where did this war come from? It can be traced all the way back to 1976 with the release of a game called Death Race. The game, being from 1976, was rather simplistic, but consisted of the player driving over what the game describes as gremlins. It is important to mention, though, that according to the National Museum of Play, these gremlins resembled humans, which made it the first game to present a human-shaped target. Other games, such as Galaga, for example, clearly have alien-esque targets. Considering this change, parents who witnessed the gameplay grew a tad bit concerned as the gremlins uttered human-like screams. According to Robert Hood's article, Violent Video Games More Ink Spilled Than Blood. Because of this controversy, the game ended up on a figurative chopping block in the media because parents grew afraid of the depicted violence. This first instance of controversy over violent video games led to one conclusion in parents' minds: violent video games must cause violence itself, and research agreed with them for a time. So did politicians such as Hillary Clinton, who, in 2005, proposed a bill that would have punished any retailer who sold an M-rated game to a minor would have faced fines and community service. As time progressed, society evolved into the realization that video games do not cause violence, but rather minor aggression at best. The Death Race controversy would be nowhere near the end for gaming. Doom, the first of the very popular first-person shooter genre, was released in 1994. Well, actually it was released in 1993 on DOS, but who's counting? In this game, a player interacts in the first person with the environment, killing enemies such as demons and monsters. This would revolutionize the gaming industry as numerous first-person shooters would follow in decades to come. That's right, COD players, Valorant players, Doom 2016 players, thank Doom for your game existing. At the time, it was controversial for depicting hell and hell-related images, as well as its overall level of violence. Recently, there have been a number of controversial incidents in gaming, such as a mission in Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, which would be known as No Russian. This depicts a player committing violence against innocent civilian NPCs, which are non-player characters for those who don't know. It was criticized by media for allowing the player to participate in a Russian terrorist attack. Additionally, the entirety of Grand Theft Auto franchise has been ridiculed for its depictions of violence or sexual actions. This has not stopped the franchise from reaching immense popularity, though, as Grand Theft Auto 5 sits on the throne of being the most sold piece of media of all time. Now that you know where this whole war began, you may ask why it happened. After all, these are just video games, right? Well, the fight can be attributed to a phenomenon that has plagued humanity throughout history: moral panics. These are something that authors Patrick Markey and Christopher Ferguson describe as a tendency for societies to develop overblown fears of an innocuous scapegoat or folk devil, which is then blamed for a real or often imagined social problem. These occur because new media often goes against the childhood of a generation that came before. The difference ultimately leads to a distrust of those participating in something new. After all, things were just so much better in the 90s, right? Usually, those people are teenagers and other young people, as they are more adaptable to change. Moral panics are not just reserved for video games either. Waltzes initially raised concerns of sexual immorality, and the thought of female voters was a shock at one time. Forms of new music, particularly those that originated in the African American communities such as jazz or rock and roll, resulted in moral panics as well. Video games, however, have unfortunately been pointed to as the culprits of serious acts of violence, namely tragedies that have occurred such as the Columbine or Winnenden mass shootings. At the time, politicians, in the face of a moral panic, demanded studies to be conducted to connect violent video games to these instances of violence. So, studies were conducted, and alarmingly, psychologists discovered that video games did cause violence. Well, not necessarily. It is common for a study to argue that exposure to media depictions of violence can cause aggressive behavior, including the imitation of violent acts, such as in the study, the causes and consequences of presence, considering the influence of violent video games on Presence and Aggression by authors Nowak, Kirkmar, and Farrar. Another study, Violent Video Games Stress People Out and Make Them More Aggressive, also states that it's well known that violent video games increase aggression. Violent video games cause aggression, which lines up both with scientific and social expectations. A player is put into a situation where they are surrounded by blood, gore, violence, sometimes in a competitive setting with popular games. Come on, we've all been there. The random in your Apex squad decides he wants to drop halfway across the world's edge without you, or your Reinhardt decides he wants to charge the enemy team, leaving you open. Definitely not speaking from experience here. It only makes sense that intense situations like these increase physiological arousal, such as heart rate, blood pressure, and skin conductance, according to Hasan, Big, and Bushman. Factors like these can upset the autonomic nervous system, which regulates the body's fight or flight response. That level of jumpiness you get when your teammates are yelling at you, clutch or kick, that's your flight or fight response. In this instance, with an upset balance, it is more likely that a player will be stressed and therefore turn aggressive. How bad is this aggression though? Surely most have seen a family member or friend rage at a game, but how is that quantified in a scientific setting? Typically it is done in one of two ways: a self-reported survey where a participant will rate how they feel with such item, in Nowak's, Kirkmar's, and Farrar's study, as I feel angry and I am burned up, I feel aggravated, I am annoyed. The other method that's typically used is blasting another player with a loud sound through headphones. The noise level in Hasan, Biggs, and Bushman's study ranged from level 1, which equals 60 decibels, to level 10, which is 105 decibels, which is about the same as a fire alarm. Yes, these are certain methods of measuring aggression, but do they translate to violence? Politicians seem to think so. In 1983, C. Everett Koop, the US Surgeon General, suggested that violent video games translated to family violence, and a decade later, the video game industry found itself under fire from Congress in the Night Trap hearings. These hearings would result in a positive for the gaming industry though: the creation of the ESRB, an entertainment rating system designed for video games. This was so that consumers would decide themselves whether or not a video game was violent based on criteria listed on a label. The ESRB has been an extremely successful method of informing parents. Knowledge of the rating system has increased from 61% in 2000 to 87% in 2006. Before the inception of the ESRB though, there was an issue that may have proved it was too little too late. During the 1990s, there was an extremely unfortunate occurrence of violence: school shootings. In this case, school shootings performed by Caucasian suburban children. This shocked parents, and ultimately an anti-video game mindset developed at the onset of a moral panic. The origin of the moral panic can be traced back to the criminals themselves. For example, in 1993, Nathan Dunlap walked into a Chuck E. Cheese from which he was fired. There, he ate a sandwich and played a video game, Hogan's Alley. He then hid in the restaurant restroom and waited for the restaurant to close. Once all the customers had cleared out, Dunlap unfortunately murdered 4 employees of the establishment. Following the tragedy, the media focused on, according to authors Markey and Ferguson, Dunlap's desire for revenge, his hatred and rage, rather than focus on any other factors. This was because violence surrounding minority children was not something that surprised society. However, when a white child commits a crime of similar magnitude, society's prejudices about violence lead us to seek to external explanations when white kids commit crimes. For example, on April 20th, 1999, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold committed an atrocity that would later be known as the Columbine Massacre. Society immediately searched for an answer as to why 2 suburban children would do such a thing. Ignoring the boys' clear issues of severe depression and anger issues, society pointed to bullying, goth music culture, or the Matrix of all things, but none of the explanations would logically fit. However, once discovered that the boys played video games such as Doom, anti-game activists locked on and associated violent video games with this tragedy. The connection was made with very little information at the time, as before this tragedy there was very little research done. According to Markey and Ferguson, articles examining video games increased nearly 300% in the wake of Columbine. Subsequently, games would continue to get blamed for years to come, such as in the Winnenden shooting. The shooter was described as a below-average student who did not participate in school activities and felt mocked by fellow students and ignored by his teachers. Video games were blamed, not mental health or any real issues that continue to be of an importance today, but something as trivial as Doom, a silly little game where a player walks around shooting zombies and demons. Unfortunately, it was natural that violent video games would get witch hunted. After all, with moral panic, politicians had to do what they are paid to do, that being quell a scared public who is simply looking for answers in time of a tragedy. So they attacked a boogeyman that could give society a sense of control and not cost them any voters: violent video games. However, politicians attempting to control video games have failed every time with court siding with the gaming industry. For example, in Video Software Dealers Association v. Schwarzenegger, the state attempted to pass a regulation similar to Hillary Clinton years earlier. The state wished to regulate the selling of video games to minors by expanding the use of the word obscenity to violent video games. The Ninth Circuit shot down this request for a variety of reasons, according to author Robert Hood. For one, the Ninth Circuit forced the state to concede that video games were protected by the First Amendment as a form of expression. Two, it is generally a principle of American society that parents have control over the raising of their children, particularly in their own homes, and the state also had a separate interest in the well-being of children. Finally, the Ninth Circuit refused to expand obscenity to include violent content, finding that the Supreme Court had always been careful to limit the scope of the obscenity definition to materials that were sexually explicit. It is also worth mentioning that the Ninth Circuit Court reviewed the evidence of the state with a large degree of skepticism. This is because the reports the state itself used had disclaimers from the researchers themselves. In Craig Anderson's study, it was found that there was a link between aggressive behavior and playing video games, which links logically to what one would expect. This is a thought well established within the field of psychology and isn't completely unreasonable to suggest, as was stated earlier. However, in an earlier court case, Craig admitted that there were numerous possible causes for increased aggression in people, that his conclusion that video games were responsible was largely a matter of his choice. Even the researchers don't believe in their evidence. What? They tried to use this in a court of law? Are you kidding me? Anti-video game activists have no basis for an argument. The court only found that the relationship between violence and video games is correlational at best, which, if you know anything about science, something correlational means there's effectively no actual connection. The gaming industry and its players as a whole are not perfect. There are rampant issues, such as the recent lawsuit from California against Activision Blizzard. The lawsuit describes several instances of female employees that have had issues related to gender, specifically regarding numerous complaints about unlawful harassment, discrimination, and retaliation at the company, as well as an overall frat boy culture. Gaming corporations are also guilty of putting loot boxes, which have been found by a large-scale survey of gamers organized by authors Zindel David and Paul Carnes, to have a link between money spent on players on loot boxes and the severity of their problem gambling. Loot boxes are not a small problem either, located in a few games. The usage of loot boxes has spread like the plague it is, from games primarily played by fully consenting adults to gullible children. Legal action and regulation have begun to be discussed for this topic. Finally, gaming addiction has begun to consume the populace. Excessive amounts of time spent playing online video games can be severely disruptive to schoolwork and real-life social contacts. The issues do not stop here, and there will continue to be more. Though these are the issues that plague the gaming industry, issues that stem from society as a whole, not the fictional folk devil that so many seem to think it is. Yes, studies show that violent video games do lead to an increase in aggression. Both common sense and clinical studies point in this direction. However, violent video games are certainly not the causation of violence or tragedies such as mass school shootings, which they continually find themselves being pointed to as the culprit to blame. In situations such as these, there is a much more common problem with mental health or societal issues. However, there's been a history of politicians attempting to quell a nervous public with whatever an older generation distrusted nor understood at the time: video games. Thank you for watching. I just want to say I appreciate it. I put a lot of work into this video, and you taking your time to watch this video, I really appreciate it. Go ahead and hit that like button if you want to see more stuff like this. I know it's kind of different than what I usually do, but also if you want to keep up with my videos, feel free to subscribe, and if you really want to keep up with my videos, hit the notification bell, as really that's the only way to get notified that I've uploaded anything and the sea of your subscriptions page. Thank you so much for watching again. I really appreciate it. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.